we speak about burning fat, we enter a conversation that touches something fundamental in human experience: the relationship between what we consume, how we move, and the slow metamorphosis of stored energy back into motion and warmth. There exists in this process a kind of poetry, though it is written in the language of biochemistry rather than verse. The body does not simply shed weight like a tree dropping leaves in autumn. Instead, it performs an intricate dance of chemical reactions, hormonal signals, and cellular decisions that transform molecules we cannot see into the energy that powers every heartbeat, every thought, every step we take into the future. Consider for a moment the nature of fat itself. We often speak of it as something to be eliminated, an unwanted guest that has overstayed its welcome. Yet fat cells, adipocytes as they are properly called, represent one of evolution's most elegant solutions to an ancient problem. Our ancestors faced a world of feast and famine, where the next meal might arrive tomorrow or next week. The ability to store energy in dense, compact form meant survival. A single gram of fat contains approximately 9 calories of potential energy, more than double what carbohydrates or proteins can offer. This efficiency allowed humans to endure migrations, winters, droughts, and all manner of hardship. The challenge we face today is that our bodies still operate according to these ancient programs, while our environment has shifted dramatically. The scarcity that shaped our metabolism has been replaced, for many, with abundance. Understanding fat burning requires us to appreciate that the body operates as an economy of energy. Every moment, your cells are making decisions about which fuel to use, where to store excess, and when to tap into reserves. These decisions are not random. They follow principles as reliable as gravity, governed by hormones, enzyme activity, and the availability of different substrates. When we eat, insulin rises to shepherd glucose into cells and encourage storage. When we rest between meals, insulin falls and other hormones like glucagon begin to whisper instructions to release stored energy. This rhythm, this metabolic tide that ebbs and flows throughout the day, determines whether we are building reserves or drawing them down. The comparison between different approaches to fat burning often begins with diet, because what we put into our bodies fundamentally shapes what our bodies do with energy. A caloric deficit, the state where we consume less energy than we expend, creates the necessary condition for fat loss. This principle is unassailable physics. Energy cannot be created from nothing. When the body needs more than we provide through food, it must turn inward to its stores. Yet how we create that deficit and what we eat within it produces vastly different experiences and outcomes. Some choose to restrict carbohydrates, embracing what has been called ketogenic eating or simply low-carb approaches. When carbohydrates drop below a certain threshold, typically around 50 grams daily or less, the liver begins producing ketone bodies from fatty acids. These molecules can cross the blood-brain barrier and fuel neural tissue, offering an alternative to glucose. The body shifts into a state called nutritional ketosis, where fat becomes the primary fuel source not just for muscles, but for the mind itself. People who follow this path often report remarkable mental clarity, stable energy throughout the day, and a diminished sense of hunger. The mechanism makes sense when examined closely. Without the sharp rises and falls of blood sugar that accompany carbohydrate-rich meals, the hormonal landscape becomes calmer. Insulin remains low and steady, which permits hormone-sensitive lipase, an enzyme that liberates fatty acids from adipose tissue, to work continuously. Yet ketogenic eating is not a panacea, nor is it the only path up the mountain. Others thrive on approaches that include substantial carbohydrates but emphasize whole foods, plants, legumes, and grains in their unprocessed forms. These fiber-rich foods slow digestion, moderate insulin response, and provide a feeling of fullness that can make caloric restriction easier to sustain. The Mediterranean diet, which has been studied extensively, demonstrates that fat loss and metabolic health can coexist with moderate carbohydrate intake when the quality of food is high and the pattern sustainable. The comparison here is not between right and wrong approaches, but between different tools that work through distinct mechanisms. Intermittent fasting introduces yet another dimension to this landscape. Rather than changing what we eat, it changes when we eat. By compressing feeding into shorter windows, perhaps 8 hours or 6, and extending the fasted state, we alter our hormonal environment in ways that favor fat oxidation. During fasting, insulin drops to baseline levels, which is precisely the signal adipose tissue needs to release its contents. Growth hormone rises, helping to preserve muscle mass even as fat diminishes. Autophagy, the cellular housekeeping process where damaged components are broken down and recycled, accelerates during extended fasts. This approach appeals to those who find freedom in simplicity, who would rather skip breakfast than count calories, who experience fasting not as deprivation, but as a kind of metabolic reset. The comparison extends beyond diet into the realm of movement, where different forms of exercise produce different effects on fat metabolism. Cardiovascular exercise, the steady-state activity we associate with jogging, cycling, or swimming at moderate intensity, burns calories during the activity itself and trains the body to become more efficient at using fat for fuel. When you exercise at a pace where you can still hold a conversation, you are working primarily within your aerobic system, which preferentially oxidizes fatty acids. Over time, this type of training increases mitochondrial density in muscle cells. Mitochondria are the organelles where fat oxidation actually occurs, the furnaces where fatty acids are broken down through beta oxidation and the citric acid cycle to produce AP, the universal energy currency. Resistance training offers different gifts. While it may burn fewer calories during a 30-minute session compared to running, it builds muscle tissue that remains metabolically active long after you rack the weights. Muscle requires energy simply to exist, to maintain its proteins and cellular machinery. Each pound of muscle tissue you add raises your resting metabolic rate slightly. More importantly, resistance training creates microscopic damage that the body repairs during rest, a process that itself consumes energy and resources. The hormonal response to heavy resistance exercise includes releases of testosterone and growth hormone that favor muscle retention and fat loss, particularly when combined with adequate protein intake. High-intensity interval training occupies a middle ground, or perhaps creates its own category entirely. By alternating bursts of maximum effort with periods of recovery, this approach generates what exercise scientists call excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. After a truly challenging interval session, your metabolism remains elevated for hours as the body works to restore equilibrium, clear lactate, replenish fuel stores, and repair tissues. The total caloric expenditure over 24 hours can rival or exceed that of much longer moderate-intensity sessions. Yet high-intensity work is demanding, requiring greater recovery and carrying higher injury risk if form deteriorates under fatigue. The comparison between these exercise modalities is not a competition to crown a single winner. A person who despises running will not sustain a running program regardless of its theoretical benefits. A person who finds weightlifting tedious will skip sessions and make excuses. The best exercise for fat burning is the one you will actually do consistently, with appropriate progression and adequate recovery. This might sound like a cop-out, a refusal to make a definitive recommendation, but it is actually a deeper truth about human behavior and physiology. Consistency over time trumps theoretical optimization. The program you follow imperfectly for 5 years will transform your body more thoroughly than the perfect program you abandon after 5 weeks. Sleep enters this conversation as a factor that many overlook, but none can afford to ignore. When sleep is chronically insufficient, when we push through exhaustion night after night, our hormonal environment shifts in ways that oppose fat loss. Cortisol, the stress hormone, remains elevated throughout the day. Ghrelin, which signals hunger, increases while leptin, which signals satiety, decreases. The result is heightened appetite, particularly for calorie-dense foods that promise quick energy. Insulin sensitivity declines, meaning the same amount of carbohydrate produces a larger insulin response, which in turn makes fat mobilization more difficult. Studies comparing people who sleep 7 to 9 hours versus those who sleep 5 to 6 hours while following identical diets show measurably different outcomes, with the sleep-deprived group losing less fat and more lean tissue. Stress itself, distinct from but related to poor sleep, activates pathways that can stubbornly resist fat loss efforts. Chronic activation of the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis keeps cortisol elevated, which promotes fat storage, particularly in visceral depots around the organs. This abdominal fat is metabolically distinct from subcutaneous fat, more inflammatory, and more closely associated with disease risk. Managing stress through meditation, time in nature, meaningful social connection, or whatever practices bring genuine calm is not a luxury for those seeking fat loss. It is a practical necessity that shapes the hormonal terrain where all our other efforts play out. The comparison between rapid and gradual fat loss deserves careful consideration. Aggressive caloric deficits, where intake is slashed dramatically, do produce faster scale changes. Physics demands it. But the body does not passively accept this state. Metabolic adaptation occurs, where thyroid hormone production decreases, non-exercise activity thermogenesis drops as we unconsciously move less throughout the day, and metabolic rate declines beyond what would be predicted by the loss of body mass alone. Hunger hormones surge while satiety signals weaken. The body, operating on ancient programming, interprets severe restriction as famine and responds with every tool evolution has provided to resist further loss and encourage regain. Moderate deficits, perhaps reducing intake by 300 to 500 calories daily, allow for fat loss that is slower but more sustainable. The body adapts less dramatically to modest restriction. Training performance can be maintained rather than suffering. Muscle mass is better preserved when protein intake is sufficient and the deficit is not extreme. Perhaps most importantly, moderate approaches teach sustainable eating patterns rather than relying on willpower to endure temporary misery. The person who loses 30 pounds over 9 months by making reasonable adjustments they can maintain is in a fundamentally different position than the person who crashes off the same weight in 3 months through measures they cannot and will not continue. Protein intake emerges as a variable that deserves special attention in any fat loss comparison. Protein is thermogenic, meaning the body expends more energy digesting and metabolizing it compared to carbohydrates or fats. Protein is satiating, creating fullness that extends beyond the meal and reduces subsequent intake. Protein provides the amino acids necessary to maintain and even build muscle tissue during caloric restriction, particularly when combined with resistance training. The evidence suggests that intakes around 1 gram per pound of body weight, or perhaps slightly less, optimize these benefits during fat loss. This is higher than general population recommendations, but reflects the specific demands of maintaining lean tissue while in energy deficit. Hydration. seemingly too simple to warrant discussion, plays roles we often underestimate. Water is required for lipolysis, the breakdown of triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. It is necessary for transporting these fatty acids through the bloodstream to tissues where they will be oxidized. Dehydration impairs exercise performance, reducing the intensity and duration we can sustain. Sometimes what we interpret as hunger is actually thirst, and drinking water before meals consistently shows modest reductions in caloric intake in research settings. The recommendation to drink when thirsty is sound for most people, though those engaged in vigorous training may need to be more intentional about replacement. The psychological dimension of fat loss, the mental and emotional experience that accompanies physical change, cannot be separated from the biological mechanisms. We are not machines that simply respond to caloric mathematics. We eat for comfort, for celebration, for connection, for distraction from difficult emotions. Food carries meaning beyond its macronutrient profile. The approach to fat loss that ignores this human reality, that treats eating as purely instrumental, sets people up for struggle. Rigid rules that categorize foods as forbidden tend to backfire, creating preoccupation and eventual rebellion. Flexible approaches that allow for treats and special occasions while maintaining overall dietary quality prove more sustainable for most people. Self-compassion during this process matters tremendously. Perfection is not required for progress. A single meal or even a single day that deviates from your plan does not erase weeks of consistent effort. The body responds to patterns, to what you do most of the time across weeks and months. The person who approaches setbacks with curiosity rather than shame, who asks what can be learned rather than engaging in self-flagellation, builds resilience that serves them far beyond any particular weight goal. Fat loss at its best is not punishment for the body you have, but an act of care for the body you are becoming. Comparing outcomes across different demographics reveals that individual variation is substantial. What works elegantly for one person may prove difficult for another due to differences in genetics, gut microbiome composition, previous dieting history, baseline insulin sensitivity, stress levels, sleep quality, and dozens of other factors. This is why rigid prescriptions, the proclamation that everyone must eat or train in one specific way, inevitably disappoint many who try to follow them. Personalization, experimentation, and patient observation of how your unique body responds to different interventions is more valuable than dogmatic adherence to any single philosophy. Age affects fat metabolism in ways worth acknowledging. Muscle mass naturally declines with each decade after about age 30, unless actively maintained through resistance training. This reduction in lean tissue lowers metabolic rate and changes body composition even if weight remains stable. Hormonal changes during perimenopause and menopause in women, or the gradual decline in testosterone in men, shift the ease with which fat is mobilized. This does not mean fat loss becomes impossible with age, but it may require more attention to resistance training and protein intake to preserve metabolic health. The purpose beneath the goal of fat loss deserves examination. If the motivation is health, improving markers like blood pressure, blood glucose control, inflammatory markers, and cardiovascular fitness, then the journey can be guided by these objective measures rather than appearance alone. If the motivation is aesthetic, wanting to look a certain way, that is valid too, though it comes with different psychological territory to navigate. If the motivation is performance, wanting to move more efficiently in sport or activity, that provides clear feedback about whether your approach is working. Understanding your why shapes which comparisons matter most and which trade-offs you are willing to make. We might consider fat loss as a form of practice, similar to meditation or learning an instrument. It requires patience, consistency, and the acceptance that progress is not linear. There will be plateaus where nothing seems to change despite continued effort. There will be whooshes where suddenly several pounds disappear overnight as water retention shifts. The scale, that most consulted oracle of progress, reflects not just fat, but water, glycogen, gut contents, and timing of meals. It is one data point among many, not the ultimate arbiter of success. What remains when we strip away the marketing, the fads, the contradictory headlines, is a simple biological truth embedded in profound complexity. Your body is an adaptive system shaped by millions of years of selection pressure, operating according to principles that are knowable and responsive to your choices. Fat loss occurs when energy expenditure exceeds intake over time. But how you create that state, how you move, how you sleep, how you manage stress, and how you relate to the entire process determines not just the outcome, but the quality of the journey and the sustainability of the result. The best approach is almost always the one that respects both the science and the human being attempting to live by it.